everybody. I hope you can hear me all right. I know the screen shows up here very well. And thank you for having us, JCC, sharing us, inviting us. I'm speaking to you on behalf of the Dana Thomas House Foundation, which is the kind of program coordinator for today, and also on behalf of the State Historic Site, which is really the place that we're talking about today. I had the privilege of actually working on the restoration of the Dana Thomas House. I was the project manager for the restoration, which was completed in 1990. I worked for the State Historic Preservation Agency for 31 years and did a lot of different projects across the state, but this was one of the highlights of my career to have worked on this. So I'm happy today to share with you a story of the house, a story of the restoration, and I would be remiss if I didn't introduce sort of a silent partner today in Doug Carr, who's a photographer with the foundation who took most of the photographs you're going to see today. The story of any place begins with a client, and this is the woman who commissioned Frank Lloyd Wright to do this. Her name is Susan Lawrence Dana, and she's very much a woman of her time. She was active, though, in politics and culture, and a very strong proponent of women's ERA. I've been watching that thing about Phyllis Schlafly, comes to mind now. But anyway, she was a champion for ERA in the 1920s. But the story of the house is that she inherited the family fortune after both her husband and her father died. She had her mother with her, but she basically took over as the leader of the family. And she determined that she wanted to build a new house, kind of as a memorial to her family, but a center for culture and society and also political events. And with that in mind, this is right around the beginning of the 20th century, she starts looking for an architect. And we know that she was involved statewide in various educational activities and that she had gone to Oak Park for a committee meeting. And we think that at that meeting, she met Frank Lloyd Wright, saw of his work, and this led to the commission. So in 1902, she commissions Wright to design a house for her. And just to put a context to this, I'm not going to explain all the history of Frank Lloyd Wright, but in 1911, Frank Lloyd Wright published a monograph of his work. It was done by Wasmuth, the German publisher, and it covered the major works that he had done in the first 20 years of his career. The Dana Thomas House and the Coonley House are the two most extensively illustrated houses in this book. It's available online. The Roby House is there. It gets kind of a less of a profile in this. So it's clear that Wright was incredibly impressed with the Dana Thomas House, showcases it prominently in this publication, and it actually begins the publication. So we know that Wright felt very strongly about the quality of the design. Just to put a timeline to the story of the house, yeah, it was built about in a 3-year period, commissioned in 1902, pretty much finished and occupied by 1904. Susan lived in it actively for about 20 years. And then she moved into a parallel smaller house that she had towards the end of her life, and the house more or less sat vacant. It was sold in 1943 to a publishing company that was a specialist in medical publishing textbooks. And the Charles Thomas Publishing Company was there for 40 years. They sold it to the state of Illinois. And we call it the Dana Thomas House today to recognize the two owners, the Susan Lawrence Dana, the original, and the Thomas Company. And they both deserve that recognition for their contribution to its story. So that's a fairly common thing to name houses after the sequence of owners. In 1981, the state of Illinois purchased the house as the first house to be purchased for its architectural and cultural significance as opposed to political stories. Most of the state-owned historic sites, starting with Lincoln's home and Grant's home, were associated with political figures. So this was a change for the state, and Governor Thompson championed that. Then between 1987 and 1990, the house was restored. And through that time period, it's been maintained by first the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency and now the Illinois Department of Natural Resources as a state historic site. Now, interestingly, the story of this house starts with an existing house. And this is very unusual for Frank Lloyd Wright. But Susan, in her way, decides that she's going to transform this. And this 1860s Italianate house, and this is the view looking at it from the southwest, becomes this, looking from the same direction. I call this Frank Lloyd Wright Does Extreme Home Makeover. You could call it a remodeling commission, but it was much more than that. It's a totally new building, but interestingly, within the inside of this, it incorporates a little memory room for the family story, which is, I think, a really unusual and unique part of the story of this house. The house, in Mr. Wright's words, was designed extensively for entertaining, and I love this quote, elaborately worked out in detail. Throughout today's presentation, you're going to hear me refer to this elaborately worked out in detail because this house is exquisite in the level of detail. It's one of its hallmarks. Just to give you a reference point of the size and scale of this, the house itself is about 12,600 square feet. There's another 3,000 square foot coach house at the back. There are 16 various levels because there's these half levels, but there's really 3 main floors, a basement, main floor, and second floor. 35 rooms, 6 fireplaces, but more importantly, all of these original artifacts designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. 100 pieces of Wright designed furniture, the art glass lamps and sconces, and 250 pieces of art glass. And all of this is intact. This is the most intact of all of Wright's commissions. It was elaborately designed, fully designed in all of these components, and it's still there because the Thomas family kept it together. And when they sold it to the state, they gave the state all the furniture. So it was never split up, which has happened to a lot of the other houses. This is the site plan for the house. It sits on Lawrence Avenue, obviously named after the Lawrence family, at 4th Street. And the original house you entered on 4th Street. On this house, you enter on Lawrence. This is the main house. This is the entertaining wing, the west wing, the gallery, the coach house at the back, and then an exterior courtyard. And there's a high brick wall around the courtyard for an enclosed exterior space. Our tour today is going to start with a walk around the outside of the house, and then we're going to go to the inside. And I've got this in a series of stages. The south side has that long horizontality that Frank Lloyd Wright is prominently known for in his design. The long eaves, the raking slow slope of the roofs. An unusual aspect of this is the formal entryway to the front facing to the street, which is not true in a lot of the other Frank Lloyd Wright houses. So this is the main prominent south elevation. The east elevation faces 4th Street. The master bedroom is up here. The living room is here. There are these 2 flanking porches. And the bedroom catches the morning sun here coming on this east side. Just as a quick summary of the materials of the house, you have the Roman brick, which is long and thin. You have the orange here is actually concrete, stained, and it's an unusual aspect of this design. Upper part of the wall here is a plaster frieze, which was restored and put back as part of the 1990s restoration. It had been removed. And then there's this copper decorated fascia going around and gutters and downspouts. A tile roof that is not very prominent. So 3 materials, but it really comes together well compositionally. The north side of the house faces the courtyard, and there's a landscape courtyard. The gallery wing is here. This is what we call the prow. It's sort of a connector between the main house here, the connector conservatory, the gallery. There's a Lincoln stairs here. This is the access to the back kitchen. The north side of the house. This is looking back at that north side. Here's the gallery wing, kitchen entrance back here, the open courtyard. But you see the high enclosed walls around it. So it's a very controlled and internal space, even though it's outside with the high walls. This is a wonderful little feature, a reflecting pool that's sort of between the kitchen and the conservatory linking to the gallery at the back. And we actually have the koi pond here and the fish in the summer. So very much a part of the sort of period style and character of materials and time period. The coach house is at the back. There would have been a horse and a carriage there, although quickly she moved to riding in a car. And this little house on the back here was actually once on this lot, and Susan moved it across the railroad tracks and maintained it. And that's where she actually lived the last years of her life. Smaller, more manageable quarters. Just to bring in a kind of an interesting detail on the exterior, this is that beautiful plaster frieze, which is painted to emulate the patina of the copper, the tile roof. And then you see this fascia with the stamped copper, and it has this wonderful little prow-like piece that sticks out, very Asian in its influence. And this is the Japanese house that was in Jackson Park in Chicago. And Wright would have known of this. Wright was an expert in Japanese prints, understood Japanese architecture. But just to go back for a digression, oops, didn't go back. That little cant of the prow that seems Asian or Japanese in inspiration. I once took a tour group of Japanese architects through the house, and I pointed this detail out. And they said that, well, maybe Thai or Korean, they said, but this isn't Japanese. So this is Wright's own invention, maybe inspired by Asian, but it's somewhat derivative and interpretive. But he would have known this. And the panelized sort of way motifs work in Japanese architecture is prominent on these interiors. One of the most celebrated decorative arts pieces of this house is the exterior plaster frieze. This is the reproduction put back in the 1990s. The original mold was there in the house for it. We knew the pattern of this. We had original pieces to get the color scheme. So this is a wonderfully part of the decorative arts of this house. Remember that term, elaborately worked out in detail. I find it quite ironic that this image was used on the cover of a book called Art Deco Architecture. This is a Frank Lloyd Wright design from 1902, but it presages the Art Deco movement by 30 years. This is actually one of my favorite views of the house, that actually one of the few that captures Susan and the house. So here she is, this very high style lady in an almost Victorian era of clothing, but standing in front of her Frank Lloyd Wright house. And it captures kind of her character as a person, but this willing risk she took to go with something completely new architecturally. Having said that, we've toured around the house, walked around the front to the back to the sides. We're now going to start to go inside. The main entrance here, a circular arch, kind of an homage to Louis Sullivan. And here's our tour path on the first floor. We're going to come in the front entry hall. We're going to go up half the flight of steps to the reception hall. And then around the reception hall, we're going to hit the living room, the parlor, the dining room, and then the mother's bedroom, which was off the first floor hallway. So there's the main living part of the house, the entertaining wing, and this wing back here is really the kitchen and servants' wings. The servants' bedrooms are upstairs. While this house is very modern in plan, in openness, it's not modern in terms of social structure. It's more like Downton Abbey. The servants are in this wing, the family is in this wing. So socially, it's still a Victorian house. Architecturally, it's something very different. This is an amazing view that looks to the inside of the house through the front door with this sculptural piece by Richard Bach. And interestingly, this exact same view is in the Wasmuth portfolio with the front door open to see the inside. The arch is a welcoming sign. You come in, you know you're supposed to come in as an entrance. And when you come in, you're greeted by this sculptural figure. You come through this arched top door and this beautiful intersecting butterfly chandelier or transom light on the front and the back of this entrance hall, and a vaulted glass dome here. It just, again, elaborately worked out in detail. And this is that detail of the butterfly chandelier. I'm sorry, the butterfly. There is a butterfly chandelier in the house. This is the butterfly transom. Here's that entry hall that you come into. The sculptural piece right here, Richard Bach is the sculptor. There's a table here. You would have been greeted by a servant who would have taken your calling card, put it on the calling card table, and you would have gone up the stairs to the reception hall. And this is that contemporary detail of that sculptural piece. And this is the photograph that's one of the lead photographs in the Wasmuth portfolio. So clearly this got high profile in Frank Lloyd Wright's publication. And I've often looked at this motif right here on the sculpture and said it's very much like the mile-high skyscraper that Frank Lloyd Wright designed in the 1950s. When you come up the main staircase, you come into this high volume reception hall. And this is a large two-story space. You see the panelized type wall system that Wright used. The brick on the inside is the same brick as the outside, so he's bringing the inside and the outside together. And these are all of these pieces of original furniture designed to go with the house. This reception hall has kind of two parts to it. The upper part on the right to the west is a lower ceiling height, and it's only a little over 6 foot high here. So there's kind of compression and expansion as you walk through in the reception hall. To the south of the reception hall is the mother's bedroom. So her mother lived with her for only a few years after the house was completed. She died, but she had her own bedroom on the first floor, so she didn't have to go up the stairs, and her own bathroom with that. This is the lower part of the reception hall, and back here is another sculptural piece, a fountain designed by Richard Bach. There's kind of the flow of water coming through this. And again, you get this idea that in designing this, Wright has got a sculpture that he works with. They commission pieces specifically for this house, integrated with the architecture. This is really at the high end of decorative arts work and architecture. And Wright, collaboration is noteworthy for this. And he works with Bach on a number of things. There's also interesting, there are other classical sculptures in the house that are upper middle class taste of the time. Off of the reception hall to the east side of the house is what we now call the living room. I find it funny, I've occasionally taken kids through the house and they always wonder, where would the TV be? This is the living room. There's no television here, guys. This is a space, and in the 19th century, it would have been called a parlor. But it's got a large table and it has this wonderful artifact here, a double pedestal lamp. It's only one Wright ever designed. And it's an exquisite piece of decorative arts that goes with this house. And this is that piece. It actually didn't come with the house when the state got the house, and it was later purchased. Governor Thompson did a fundraiser to raise money to buy some of the few artifacts to put back in the house that were missing. And it's still got its place in the living room. Off of the living room are two outdoor porches, and you can see how expansive they are. Although I will admit, wide angle photography sometimes make things look bigger than they are, but indoor and outdoor spaces, the outdoor spaces with the brick that tie into the walls on the inside, and similar level of finishes and materials. Now, one of the unique absolute spaces in this house, it's like none of the other Frank Lloyd Wright houses, is the original parlor shape. This is a parlor room that was the parlor from the Victorian house, with the Victorian mantle still there. And this was incorporated into the house as kind of Susan's memory room to her family. And we interpret it today with some Victorian furniture and some pictures of her family. Interestingly enough, Frank Lloyd Wright didn't have any pictures taken of this room. He wasn't showcasing this. He showcased his new design work. He didn't showcase this, but it actually is, I think, one of the interesting parts of the program, incorporating an older part of a building to tell a story of memory. And Susan obviously had an influence on this. And this little black bar over here has an interesting little sculptural piece. And here's the butterfly again, or a flower. And that butterfly motif repeats itself when you come in the entrance of the house. And this is Frank Lloyd Wright showing incredible sensitivity to an owner, to unique aspects of their interest in design, and taking an inspiration and integrating it together. This is part of the genius of his design, to be inspired by a detail like this, and then putting the butterfly motif over the entrance door when you come in. Now, off of the dining room, or off of the parlor and the reception hall is the dining room, a barrel vaulted space with a recessed alcove of light for lighting, a musician's balcony, a long table, and we could sit 16 people at this table for major events. We could also there's a breakfast nook. This is one of the most magnificent spaces in this house. We call these the Butterfly Chandeliers. They sometimes, during the certain light, they cast almost a butterfly motif on the wall. So this is a celebrated space, and this is a view on the left from the Wasmuth portfolio, and the duplicated view on the right that is available on the Dana Thomas House Foundation website. All the original Wasmuth photos you can see, and then you can see the modern image. So there's a way to go the then and now through this. And here's, again, looking back the other way from the dining room. to the reception hall up above. This is, we call this the musician balcony, the reception hall back there. Another prominent detail of this house is this mural by George Niedecken. You see the sumac motif here of the sumac flower. And here you see it, the sumac plant with the deep red of the fall foliage. And all through the house, the woodwork is stained deep red, picking up on that motif. And almost all the other Frank Lloyd Wright houses have golden oak as the color of the woodwork. In this house, the red would have been chosen for that purpose. Now, no expert came up with that theory. My wife came up with that theory. She's the first person to express this idea that they picked the red stain to go with the mural. And I'm sticking to that story. It makes sense to me. But again, it shows Wright taking one inspiration of nature. Why Susan picked, or why they picked the sumac, we don't know, but he uses it intensively. And here's, again, details of this George Niedecken mural. And these colors, this deep ochre, the red, then repeat themselves in the use of the fabrics and the designs in the house. Here you see in the breakfast nook, the sumac motif in the glass. And again, these are just, again, some of the most celebrated designs in decorative arts, in American decorative arts history, and Frank Lloyd Wright's architecture. It's all original, it's all here. There's some teak oak pottery here. We actually have a receipt that shows Susan bought about 20 pieces of teak oak pottery for the house. We don't have all of them at this point. And here's more of a detail of the sumac motif interpreted in glass. And you get down to kind of tiny little 1/4 inch by 1/4 inch pieces of glass cut into this. And the zinc cane, it's called, that makes the lines. It's not leaded glass, it's zinc. And Frank Lloyd Wright would hate this, but it's called colonial style zinc cane. So that's one of our trivia questions. What colonial style element was used in this Frank Lloyd Wright house? Now we've toured around the main living room spaces of the first floor of the house. We're still going to tour 3 more parts of the house. And now we're going to go to the second floor. The main entry came on the south. Here's a landing, and here's that reception hall, but this is the upper floor, and there's a gallery around it. This is the master bedroom and the bathroom. So now we're going to go up to the second floor. Oops, why am I not advancing? You come up a stair landing, and to the south on the right side will be bright lights from the south window. You're looking over that reception space. And here is the view looking back to the south of that hallway. We were just on this landing, the big south windows, this high volume. You're looking now all the way down to the entrance and the fountain, or the sculpture here. And this gives you the full sense of the scale of this space. It's huge as a volume, and yet you get to experience it from below, from up above, from walking around. Behind me is a built-in player organ. I call it her home entertainment system that was available. And off to the left here, we're going to walk around and go into the master bedroom. So this is what you would see as you enter the master bedroom. You're now looking off to the east, more decorative art glass, original furniture, and there are 2 of these built-in bureaus here with the mirrors, makeup tables, built-in storage. There's drawers at the end. There's 2 of these flanking this room. And as we turn in this room, looking back, there are 2 beds here, what we call the Ozzie and Harriet style of bedroom motifs, the vaulted ceiling, a fireplace, and all through the house there are these curtains on brass rings so you can kind of do semi-privacy in spaces. And you find these in all of these Frank Lloyd Wright houses at the turn of the century. Very common detail. Now we're going to go back around here to the master bathroom, fairly small, but it's filled with all the modern amenities, and it even has a built-in shower here, which doesn't show up in the original plans, but it shows up in the early renovation, and so it's kept as part of the interpretive period. There's a built-in shower. There's a small anteroom here that isn't interpreted and isn't illustrated in anything, and it's used for telling a little bit of the story of Susan. From here now, we're going to go, that bathroom is right above here. We're going to go past the dining room. We're going to go down the stairs here. This is the servants' pantry, the kitchen, then we're going to go back to the entertaining wing. So we're coming down the back stairs to the serving pantry. To the right, it goes off to the dining room. So this would have connected through to the dining room and to the kitchen. And this, again, I said this is Downton Abbey. There's a whole back door space that serves the servants with the bedrooms upstairs, and they can get to the basement and connection. The kitchen itself is very modern with ribbon windows that are high, a long counter. There would have been a working table in the middle, another counter over here. To my back is a big walk-in refrigerator that originally was an ice box, then it was electrified. There are 2 stoves in here. There's a coal and wood burning stove or a small gas stove. So she could host big parties. She had a cook on staff. Interestingly, right here, this little detail is a plate warming radiator. So in the winter when the heat was on, you could store your plates on there and keep them warm. This is that serving pantry back there. A very modern space for its time. Now from here, we're going to connect through the conservatory, which is a long horizontal room that goes between the main house and the gallery for entertaining. So if you came up from the front entry, you would go to your left and come down this conservatory. There is a south porch at one end, and then you look out on the other side to the south porch is on the right side, and the other side is that little alcove with the reflecting pond. You come around through the prow, and now all of a sudden you're in another vaulted ceiling space, the ribbed vaults with a musician balcony, and this is the gallery, her entertaining wing. This is where receptions happened. Behind the fireplace here, literally, there's a small catering kitchen. This is very modern, thinking through the details. There's a small kitchen and sink there with access to the back door that could connect to go to the kitchen for serving. So she knew how to host events. You come in, you were greeted, your coats were taken, you come to the entertaining wing. I'm sure there were many political discussions that took place here. She was friends with the governor who just lived down the street. And the time that she was living here was the time when women's suffrage was a hot story. Illinois gave women the right to vote in 1913. I'm sure that Susan was in on that action. And then obviously in 2020, we are at the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage in America. And Illinois was not the first state to ratify the amendment after it passed through Congress. We were there quickly though. And it took a while, but it did pass. I think Tennessee was the 38th state to pass it, where it became law. This is looking from the other side of this gallery space. For those of you who know a little more about Frank Lloyd Wright's work, he also did a vaulted space like this that's a children's room in his home and studio, but then he doesn't use this format again in the other Prairie School houses. So it's another distinctive feature of this house. Looking up here is another part of the decorative arts artifact, and it's what we call the hanging tapestry. And when you look at this and you see this double T motif, these are hanging tapestry art glass panels. And this takes you to that Japanese architectural inspiration. And again, it's very subtle in what Wright does. It's not direct, but we know he appreciated Japanese architecture and uses that, but he interprets it in his own way, and that's why he's so good. Now this is looking from the stairs from the gallery, looking down into the library down below. Here's the Wasmuth view on the left, the contemporary photograph on the right, and you see Michelangelo's David. This classical sculptors in white were upper middle class architecture, or upper middle class taste of the time, and these show up in all of the Frank Lloyd Wright houses. When you look through the Wasmuth portfolio, you'll see these frequently in the different interiors. So there's nothing new about that, but it's sort of a way in which you could contrast something that doesn't conflict with Frank Lloyd Wright. It shows a complete different change. You know it's not his design, and it's accepted as part of that. It's a sophisticated design motif. Looking down into the lower space, this is the library. It's got a very low ceiling. We're going to go, this is the library at the bottom, and this is the bowling alley. So we're going to go down to this last space on the lower floor. So this is what that library looks like. There's a series of carrels built into the side. She didn't have an extensive library, but she did have children's books. She hosted children's activities. And I find it quite interesting that 1903, more or less when this house was completed, was also the year that the that the Carnegie Library was completed in Springfield, and that's a classical revival structure. But one of the noteworthy aspects in here is this furniture right here is not from this house. But at the time this house was being built, the city had a new school going up, and Susan paid for a new library in the school building. That library was designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. It was built in the early 20th century. This is the furniture from it because the school board took that library out in the 1950s. Thomas's acquired the furniture. So this is Frank Lloyd Wright furniture commissioned by Susan for a Frank Lloyd Wright designed library that no longer exists, and the furniture is now returned here. So it tells two stories. Susan's largesse of sharing her wealth to build a library and another community facility, a school facility. She also supported a Lincoln Colored Home, which was an orphanage for Black children in the system, in the city. So she had a lot of different philanthropic things that she did. But this kind of is a double story of Frank Lloyd Wright design coming together. Just from a preservation architect, I can tell you this was one of the more complicated parts of the restoration, because where you see these steel or these wooden beams here, we actually had to replace the wooden beams with new steel beams in a structural intervention that required the whole ceiling to be taken down, extensive shoring. It was probably the most complicated part of the restoration. You would never know it looking at it today. There's this wonderful little unique space in the basement that connects from the library back to the front entry hall. There is this one-lane duck pin bowling alley. Duck pins are thinner, uses a smaller ball. So that's kind of the bowling alley space, which is kind of fun as a space. And it would have been an interconnecting space for the use of staff in terms of the front entryway to the back, the gallery wing there. And there's a little billiard table and parlor or billiard table to the left and a skylight. Now that completes most of the tour of the house. And I'm going to take a little more time now to just talk about the highlights of the restoration. The state purchased the house in the 1980s and then undertook basically a 3-year exploration of the house and then a 3-year restoration. The spearhead for this project was Governor James Thompson, who championed this project, and architect Will Hasbrook, who just died last year, who was the project architect for the restoration. And Will and his wife started the Prairie School Review, which was a journal about prairie school architecture that he started in the 1950s or 60s and extended the reference and scholarship on Frank Lloyd Wright and his peers. So he was one of the early experts on looking at the prairie school architects and the architecture of Chicago. So he and his team led the restoration effort, 3 years and $5 million to do the work. The exterior of the building sat next to the train tracks, and this is years of coal-fired steam locomotives and their smoke coloring and staining the brickwork. This is how dirty it was. This during the restoration period, prior to the restoration, these are test panels of different masonry cleaning products. So not only did the brick have to be cleaned, and here you see it in its cleaned original format, but another unique aspect of the design is the vertical mortar joints are stained to match the brick. The horizontal joints are raked and horizontal, so you get a horizontality of the shadow lines. The Thomases, when they bought the house, filled in all these horizontal joints with new modern gray mortar to make it more durable. We had to cut all of those out to return this to the original design as well. So there's cleaning and cutting and tuck pointing, a huge amount of masonry work on the exterior for the restoration that when you look at it today, you're not supposed to be able to tell anything happened. I was once told a perfect restoration is like a perfect haircut. You're never supposed to know it's happened. The exterior, besides the Roman brick with its raked joints, was concrete. And the concrete was stained an orange color. So the concrete was cleaned, repaired, some pieces replaced, the orange stain put back. And for those of you who know Frank Lloyd Wright's work and the Unity Temple in Chicago or in Oak Park, Unity Temple was 1907, and there Frank Lloyd Wright leaves the concrete in the raw state as gray concrete with the aggregate. Here he's using it and using it like stone in pieces and staining it. It's another unique aspect of the Dana Thomas house, the way Frank Lloyd Wright uses concrete. And he uses concrete extensively in his career, from Falling Water to the Guggenheim to the textile block houses. He really used that material in all kinds of different ways. And this is one of the ways in which, in the experimenting of his style, he did something different with the Dana house. The restoration of the house included removing all of the art glass windows, and they were reinforced, cleaned, repaired. Some cases, very little of the actual decorative glass had to be replaced. Some of the plain glass had to be replaced, but some of the zinc cane had to be replaced and customized to match. The company that makes the zinc cane is still intact today. It's called Chicago Metallic out of Chicago Heights, Illinois. So this product was still readily available, but almost 10% of the restoration cost was the whole restoration of all of the art glass, taking it out. And then afterwards, exterior storm windows or secondary glazing was put on the house to protect the exterior of the windows. And from the inside, you would notice it did make a slight difference from the outside, but that was a big part of the restoration, the details. And again, when you see these pieces, every one of these little squares is a 1/4 inch. And there were literally people with Q-tips cleaning and repairing and getting every one of these glass panels just perfectly new and then put back in and ready to last the next 100 years. That cycle of restoration is a long one. Besides the decorative arts of the built-ins, the windows and things, there are all of these sconce lamps, which were fitted out with replica carbon filament bulbs. Those are hot today if you're in the steampunk look. These have come back now as a style, but we replicated the lighting levels. The Dana house was one of the first houses in Springfield to be fully electrified. So we have all these sconce lights throughout the house, both table sconces and wall sconces. We have 3 of these, I think 2 of these single pedestal lamps and 1 double pedestal lamp. Again, a highly distinctive Frank Lloyd Wright design. And the furniture of the house was all removed and refinished. And there's a big debate about that. So for you, those who wonder about restoration, you're told that if you have an original finish on furniture, you're not supposed to restore it because restoring it removes the value. This is an original piece of furniture from the house that was not refinished. And it looks very much like golden oak. This is a restored piece of furniture in the house with the red stain put back on it. And we know the Sumac Motif, the red stain was on the woodwork, was on the furniture. So in terms of completing the story of the restoration, they're all supposed to match. The woodwork of the red stain, the woodwork of the red stain in the house are supposed to be part of this reason for choosing this, matching up to the colors. So we restored all the furniture, even though we knew it would, quote, reduce the value. Governor Thompson, who was very interested in antiques, was in on that discussion, and he said, I get it. Your premise of restoration and telling the story of a unique artwork of the house that has to be integrated between these two, that's the story. The state has no interest in selling this furniture. Its goal is to tell the interpreted story of getting the story right. So we have 1 piece of furniture we left unfinished as a part of the contrast to tell that story of restoration. We also have a room in the house that we did not restore, or we restored half to kind of tell the story of the restoration. Now, throughout the house, you've heard me talk about the Sumac motif, the inspiration for the woodwork color, the motif of the Niedecken design mural. Here is a literal or a visual interpretation of this sumac pod on the woodwork of the house. This is from the master bedroom. And then in the back, you see woodwork that's dark brown. The actual woodwork today is much more reddish stained. It was restored when the state bought the house. The woodwork was all deep brown. It happened through the Thomas era. And all the walls were white. creamy white. So the Thomases painted all the woodwork, or they painted all the walls in off-white, and all the woodwork was stained a deep dark brown. But this is the motif of Wright interpreting nature. The last and most important part of the features of the house that you saw throughout the interior were the walls. And here are 3 panels of the walls. This is from the Victorian room, this is from the mother's bedroom, and this is from the entry hall. And this is rough textured plaster with a color system that includes a finish glaze and an undercolor that's sort of modeled. So Frank Lloyd Wright, in even doing the finishes of the interior, couldn't just leave a wall alone. He had to work with the nature of the materials, and this is a unique aspect of this design. Although it's not unique in that he used it extensively through the Victorian era. Will Hasbrook said, putting back the finishes and the color of this house was the most important part of the restoration, because no one had seen the house in color. The Wasmuth portfolios were in black and white. There were no pictures in color before the restoration. So we feature these black and white images and show the house in color today, because that brought the interior into its completeness. The project was completed in 1990, and the touring has gone on with some disruption since then. The state invites you to visit again. I have talked to my friends and colleagues at the state, and they say the state historic sites are scheduled to open soon. We don't have an exact date, but they will be setting up a reservation system. I know the Illinois State Museum is opening up on July 1st. So we know that it's going to be back in business for tourism again soon. This is kind of where we lead you. Now, if we were on a typical tour, we would take you to the gift shop at the end. But I can take you to the virtual gift shop, because if you go to the Dana Thomas House Foundation website, you can learn about joining the Thomas House Foundation, shop at our gift shop, learning more about the house. We have an extensive amount of information about the house beyond what's in this tour, the photographs that Doug Carr has done. The State Historic Site also has some information about the house, but the state is the steward and the owner and the tour guide and the people that keep this. We are part of the people that tell of the legacy of this story and promote it. So I want to thank you for listening to me today and taking in this first of our virtual tour. And as I understand it now, this is the part of the program where we're going to move to questions.
Mike, that was fascinating. I can't wait to get out of my house and go and see some other houses. So there are a few questions, and
Sure.
If anyone has a question, please type it into the chat box. If you can type it privately, that would be great. The sound wasn't working. This has been recorded, so you'll be able to find it on our YouTube channel in a couple weeks. So how long did the actual restoration of the house take?
I would say it was 3 years of planning and then 3 years of construction done in 3 different bid formats. The first format was the mechanical systems, plumbing, all the hidden stuff. The second part, and that got also some of the major architectural features. The last part was the decorative arts, all the finishes, and then there was a separate artisan contract for the art glass through that. So 3 different separate phases coming together at a total price of about $5 million, which I think the Martin House in Buffalo, they're somewhere around $30 million that they've spent. And so we came in pretty well on price. It was all done by the low bidder through the Public Bidding Act of the state of Illinois.
So $5 million to restore, but it was $60,000 to originally build.
Yeah, and I think if you do the math, 60,000 is like $1 million today. So that math doesn't exactly extrapolate.
So how much bigger was this particular house than the average size house in the neighborhood?
Oh, I would say 10 times. I mean, a typical bungalow of that time. Well, Susan's earlier house would have been about 3,000 square feet, the Victorian house. So this one's about 12,000. So this is, again, large scale for a house, although it doesn't look that large in some ways because it's that low horizontality of it. But a typical house of the time might have been, 2,000 square feet. I think a typical house today is 2,400 square feet. I also think it's noteworthy that Susan chose to rebuild on the site of her family house. In 1900, there was a new subdivision around Washington Park at the west edge of town, and that's where all the new big houses were being built. But Susan chose to rebuild on the site of the family house, and I think it's to be closer to the action. We're only a couple of blocks from the governor's mansion and only about 5 or 6 blocks from the Capitol. So if this is going to be a place for activities and interests that affect political life and community life, she's still effectively close to the downtown.
So she was ahead of her time in tear down and rebuild, right?
Well, I said this is Frank Lloyd Wright does extreme home makeover.
So you talked about the sumac and you talked about the butterfly. This house happens to be named after the people who lived in it, but we had a presentation earlier this week for the Dr. Christian house, and that was called Samara. So why is this house named after the people who lived in it? Why did Frank Lloyd Wright name the other house after that Samara nut tree pine cone thing?
Yeah, I know. We don't have any history evidence that tells us there was a special name to this. I do know that when the Thomases occupied the house, they used the term Bannerstone House. So the Thomases gave it a name that was part of their branding, but they really didn't change the house that much. They kept the plan intact. The frieze came off. They did some painting, but they were actually quite good stewards. And when they sold the house to the state for $1 million, they gave the state all of the furniture and claimed it to be worth $1 million, so for tax purposes. They were incredibly generous in that offer. So I think the idea that we call it the Dana Thomas House and recognize the original owner and the second owner is very appropriate, but no other special name was given to it.
How often do you think Susan hosted parties, and how many people do you think fit in the house at one given time?
But it's interesting, we once counted the coat hooks in the basement, and there's a coat room in the basement, and figure you could put about 300 coats in there. So, that might be at the upper limit of this. The gallery can easily hold 50 to 60 people at a time. And we've had events with 100 or 200 people at a time. We do the foundation does an event in the summer, and we use the outdoor courtyard and set something up, and then people are coming through the house. So there's some debate about what's the best occupancy load of the house today for safety purposes, but easily you could have had 200 people, but today it's more like 50 to 100. And on any given day, the tours are limited to 15 people at a time so that one docent can take you through. Now, the other part of your question was Susan's activities. We actually know because her parties would be written up in the local newspaper as social events. And they would describe things like what color, what furniture, or what food did she have, and the decoration. They didn't often describe the house very much, but the purpose of an event and that she was hosting things would be written up in the social pages of the Springfield papers in the early 20th century.
You mentioned when we were in that one room that there were the arches like there are in Oak Park at the home.
I called it the barrel vaulted ceiling, and it's in the dining room here and in the gallery. And then Frank Lloyd Wright similarly used that in the children's playroom in his house in Oak Park. And that's the only 3 times he uses that particular barrel vaulted ceiling space inside. And it's hidden by the roof line. You don't see it expressed on the outside. Although in this exterior view, you can see the arch of the barrel in the window at the end of the gallery here.
Is there one distinct feature that you'd find in every single Frank Lloyd Wright house?
I would say the main feature that is similar in all of these is the walls having a sort of a framing panel work of woodwork and then plaster surfaces. He hated wallpaper that would be faking it over the real material. So he uses this rough textured plaster and the framing, which also is something you would find in Japanese architecture. But it's the long horizontality of the lines that are consistent from the exterior. And this house really has that.
Yeah, someone's asking about Susan's clothes. How would she buy all the fabric so one would match her clothes?
Well, actually, there's an interesting story in this. When they had the estate auction and sold off Susan's estate, they found this little cubbyhole closet in the building that was filled with bolts of fabric. And the story that came out of that is that when a new design of fabric came to the store in town, Susan would buy the whole bolt and have a dress made out of it. But that way, no other woman in town would show up with the same dress or the same fabric being used. I can't tell you that that's exactly true, but it's probable. It's within realm of probability. But she would be the kind of person who would hire, buy a bolt of fabric and have a seamstress make a custom piece of clothing for her.
What was your favorite part, most difficult part, least difficult part of the restoration?
Well, I would say one of the most difficult parts was getting the pricing right. How much is it going to cost? The bidding phases. So there was some, skill in trying to get that, and we had to rebid things a couple of times to get it all put together. But we did it under the low bid process, and that worked. Technically, I would say the finessing of the finishes, that wall finish with the stripping all of the plaster of the paint that was on there. You had to go to the bare plaster, then patch, and put everything back with the finishes. And it was a messy process that had to be done throughout the house. So that last phase of the finishes was intense, of the skill work. And there was a team of painters on that, but largely a husband and wife team that championed that. And they were skilled painters in their 60s that were really knew old school techniques. And the craftsmen who worked on this rose to the challenge. Everybody knew this was a signature house to be proud of. When the house was finished, we hosted a party for all the workers and their families, and 170 people came to see what their father or brother or husband or whatever had worked on the house. That was nice, the excitement of seeing it happen.
Is there one thing that you would change or do over if you could, or do you think that it's as it should be?
I think that is an absolutely wonderful question. And it's actually one of the ones I frequently ask when I tour an historic house. So whoever asked that, thank you. I didn't prompt you in anything. And because I think it's a really great question. You've learned about it. What would you do differently? And my answer is actually surprising to people. One of the things that we did is that we left one room, one of the servants' bedrooms, we left it half unrestored and half restored. And now when we do restoration tours, we take people in there and we show you the process and the story of the restoration. If I had it to do over again, I think I would have left more samples of that throughout the house, things that reveal the story of our restoration. And they would also then allow future generations to check our restoration and go, how well a job did we do? Because sometimes we did things that were destructive. When we removed all the finishes from the wall to refinish it, we basically preempted future generations from checking our work. So I would have maybe left more unrestored areas to tell the story of the restoration as part of it.
Have you restored any other Frank Lloyd Wright houses or any other historical buildings?
Actually, about the same time I was working on this house, I was working on the David Davis house, which is in Bloomington, Illinois. And Judge Davis was appointed by Abraham Lincoln to the US Supreme Court. And there's a wonderful contrast of stories. The Dana Thomas house, we have this house and we have the artifacts, we have Frank Lloyd Wright's drawings, we have lots of information from the architect's side about the house, and we have absolutely no information from Susan's side of the house, meaning she died with no heirs, there's no family papers, so we don't have a lot of things that would help answer the why questions on Susan's house. On the Davis mansion, the house was being built while Judge Davis was at the Supreme Court. His wife would write him letters and talk about the story of the house building, and we have all of her letters that tell the story of the house and what's going on and what's happening with it. So not only do we have the house to restore, but we have the original story from the owner of the building of the house and what's happening and how it's being used. And so it's a wonderful way to connect the story to the owner, and a very different approach to that. And again, a preservation architect of high caliber working on the project, Pantry on that one. So I was able to work with very high-end restoration projects with wonderful talent and exemplary buildings to showcase the talent of the restoration of the state historic sites.
If you had your choice to restore any building in the United States, which one would it be?
Uh-oh, that's a good question. But, you know, it's funny and interesting, but I have a lot of interest in architecture and history, but I think I'm really most fond of Main Street. And I grew up outside Galena. I love Galena's Main Street. So there's some Main Street buildings I'd like to champion. I actually have an idea for reconstructing a Main Street building from the turn of the century. That's on my secret things I want to do someday, is I want to reconstruct a Main Street building that no one's done before, but everyone will recognize. So that's my secret is out. I actually, the restoration architect who wants to reconstruct a building.
Fair enough. Last call for any questions via the chat box. Mike, this is fascinating. I'm so grateful that you were able to put this together and take the time to join us. We had been asked about a recording. The recording needs to be approved by the state, and then you'll be able to find it hopefully on our YouTube channel, JCC Chicago. Please join us tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. We will be joined by Ronnie Pelk from Burnham Block in Kenosha, Milwaukee. And we've got a few more Frank Lloyd Wright things coming up in July. Please visit our website, jccchicago.org. Again, Mike, thank you. Please let Doug know that his pictures are fantastic. They really helped make your commentary wonderful. So we appreciate it. Thank you to the Dana Thomas House Foundation also for letting you join us today. Wishing everyone good health. Stay safe. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.